Amara Johnson woke to the sound of her mother's voice humming low in the kitchen. The melody was tired, half forgotten, the sort of song that carried more weight than joy. Their apartment walls were thin, but even if they hadn't been, the smell of reheated oatmeal would have drawn Amara out of bed. She rubbed her eyes and slipped her feet into worn sneakers, their soles so thin she could feel the coolness of the linoleum. The kitchen was a small square room, painted in the faded yellow of long-ago tenants. Her mother stood at the stove, her back bent ever so slightly, stirring oatmeal in a dented saucepan. She was still in her work uniform, her name tag reading Angela J., though the edges of the tag had long since chipped away. "Morning, baby," Angela said without looking up. "Eat while it's hot. It's all we've got today." Amara nodded. She didn't complain, she never did. She had learned early that her mother worked double shifts to keep the lights on and to make sure there was something, anything, on the table. Some mornings, it was only toast. Others, it was oatmeal so thin it was more water than oats. But Amara always ate it gratefully. She finished her bowl quickly, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and pulled her school bag close. She opened it carefully, revealing the lunchbox inside. It wasn't new, blue paint chipped at the corners, stickers half peeled from years of use, but inside it held treasure. A simple sandwich, an apple, and a small juice box her mother must have managed to afford last night. Amara stared at it as though it were gold. "Don't lose that," her mother said, finally turning around. Her eyes were tired but soft. "That's your whole day." Amara smiled faintly, slinging the bag over her shoulder. She kissed her mother's cheek, whispered a thank you, and walked out into the world. The streets were already busy, though not with wealth. Cracked sidewalks stretched for blocks, weeds pushing up between the breaks. Vendors shouted half-heartedly over sagging carts of bruised fruit. The sound of sirens, distant but familiar, echoed like the rhythm of the neighborhood. Amara walked steadily, lunchbox thumping softly in her bag. She kept her chin high, though the weight of stares from groups of older kids sometimes followed her. They laughed among themselves, tossing soda cans against the curb, their sneakers spotless in contrast to hers. But she was used to it. She walked past them without breaking stride. It was under the rusted lamppost at the corner that she first saw him. A boy no older than 7, maybe 8, curled up on the concrete. His clothes were dirty, his hair tangled, his shoes missing. His arms hugged his knees tightly, and his face was buried so deep it was as if he was trying to disappear. Amara slowed. Children her age knew better than to stop for strangers. But this boy, he was trembling. His shoulders shook with quiet sobs, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were wide, wet, and lost. She stepped closer. "Hey, are you okay?" The boy sniffled, wiping his nose on the back of his hand. His lips parted, but no sound came. His stomach growled loudly enough to answer for him. Amara froze. She glanced down the street, people walked by without looking. They had their own problems, their own hunger, their own struggles. But something in her chest tightened. She remembered the weight of her lunchbox. The sandwich. The apple. The juice box. Her stomach, already hollow from thin oatmeal, gave a warning ache. She thought of recess at school, when all the other kids would open their lunches. If she gave hers away, she'd sit empty-handed. Again. But then she looked back at him. The boy's eyes, big, brown, frightened, met hers, and for a moment, he looked less like a stranger and more like a mirror. He could have been anyone's brother. Anyone. Son. Without another thought, she slipped off her bag, pulled out the lunchbox, and set it on the sidewalk in front of him. Here, she whispered. The boy blinked. For me. His voice was so small she barely heard it. Amara nodded, opening the box to show him. It's not much, but it'll help. His hands shook as he reached for the sandwich, biting into it like he hadn't eaten in days. Crumbs scattered on his lap, juice ran down his chin, but he didn't stop. He devoured it with a desperation that made Amara's throat tighten. When he finally paused to breathe, he looked at her again. Thank you, he whispered. His voice cracked, heavy with sincerity. You're the nicest person in the whole world. Amara swallowed hard, forcing a smile. She shrugged, trying to play it off like it wasn't a big deal. But her chest felt warm in a way she couldn't describe. By the time she reached school, the ache in her stomach had grown sharper. Her classmates tore open bags of chips and traded cookies. She sat quietly at her desk, pretending to read, her empty lunchbox tucked deep inside her bag. At recess, one of the girls with bright sneakers and braided hair smirked. Hey, Amara. What's in your lunch today? Oh wait, nothing, right? Laughter erupted. Amara didn't answer. She just looked up at the sky, at a single bird cutting across the clouds, and told herself she had made the right choice. That night, when she got home, her mother asked the usual question, eat all your lunch? Amara hesitated. For a moment, she thought about lying. But she couldn't. She nodded slowly and said, yes, Mama. I ate it. Her mother smiled faintly, though her eyes still carried exhaustion. Amara excused herself, went into her small room, and sat on the edge of her bed. She pulled her worn diary from under the mattress, opened it to a blank page, and wrote with the stub of a pencil. Today I gave my meal away. It hurt, but it felt right. Maybe kindness is the only food that never runs out. She closed the diary, hugged it to her chest, and lay back, staring at the cracked ceiling. The hunger in her belly was sharp, but the warmth in her heart was sharper. Somewhere outside, in the distance, an engine roared down the avenue. Amara barely noticed. She didn't yet know that the small act of kindness she had offered would echo louder than any hunger, farther than any street corner, that it would one day rattle the gates of a billionaire's empire. That night, Amara barely slept. The ache in her stomach pulsed like a hollow drum, each growl echoing in the quiet of their cramped apartment. She pulled her thin blanket up to her chin and closed her eyes, but every time she drifted near sleep, the image of the boy returned. His hands clutching her sandwich. The way he had eaten like it was the first real food he'd tasted in days. The words he'd whispered, "You're the nicest person in the whole world," rang louder in her ears than the hum of the fridge. By morning, the hunger was sharper. Still, she rose quickly, unwilling to let her mother see weakness. Amara Johnson worked too hard, sacrificed too much. She didn't need to be burdened with the truth that her daughter had given away the only real meal she'd had yesterday. In the kitchen, the oatmeal was back. Thin, watery, stretched with milk powder and sugar that never quite dissolved. Amara ate without complaint, though the taste made her throat tight. She scraped the bowl clean, pretending it filled her. Her little brother, Malik, sat across from her, legs swinging from the chair. At 6 years old, his smile was a flash of light in the dim kitchen. "I dreamed we had pancakes," he announced proudly. "And they were this big." He stretched his arms wide. Angela chuckled, though her laughter carried weariness. "Dreams don't cost a thing, baby. Pancakes will have to wait. Amara smiled at her brother, though her heart pinched. She wished she could give him those pancakes. She wished she could give him more than a dream. On the walk to school, Amara's bag felt lighter without the lunchbox. Her mother hadn't packed one. Perhaps there hadn't been enough bread left. Or perhaps Angela assumed her daughter still had leftovers. Either way, Amara's hands brushed the empty pocket of her bag and felt the hollow sting. The streets buzzed with their usual rhythm. Vendors shouted over carts of fruit, horns blared, sirens wailed in the distance. But Amara noticed something different. A black SUV parked on the corner of Maple. Its windows were tinted, reflecting only the cracked buildings around it. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure move inside. Watching. Waiting. Her steps faltered. Then she shook her head. Nobody important ever came to this part of Eastbrook. Not unless they were lost. She pressed on. At school, hunger made the hours heavy. Math problems swam on the page. Words blurred in her reading book. The emptiness inside her was louder than the lessons. By lunchtime, she sat quietly at her desk, while the other children tore into sandwiches, chips, cookies. A boy across the room offered her a piece of his pretzel, snickering as he did. Want it, Amara? It's the last one. Better hurry. He tossed it on the floor. The classroom erupted in laughter. Amara's cheeks burned, but she didn't move. She wasn't going to crawl under desks for scraps. She lifted her chin and stared out the window instead, at the same bird that had circled the playground yesterday. She imagined flying with it, high above the city, away from hunger and cruel laughter. When the bell rang, she walked home in silence. Her body ached with fatigue, each step heavier than the last. Home was no easier. The fridge rattled when she opened it, its shelves nearly bare, half a carton of milk, a jar of pickles, and a few eggs. She closed it quickly, as though the sight itself could bruise her. Her mother came home late, shoulders slumped, shoes in her hand. She collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table, rubbing her temples. Another shift tomorrow, she murmured. They're short-staffed. Always short-staffed. Amara wanted to tell her everything, to confess about the boy, the lunchbox, the gnawing hunger, but when she saw the deep lines in her mother's face, she swallowed the words. Instead, she busied herself making tea with the last of the sugar, placing the steaming cup in her mother's hands. "You're my little angel," Angela whispered, smiling weakly. Amara's chest ached with both pride and guilt. Later, after Malik fell asleep, Amara pulled out her diary. The stub of her pencil scratched against the page. Day 2. No lunch. No food. But I keep thinking about that boy. Where did he go? Did he find his way home? Is he still hungry? She tapped the pencil against her lip. Then wrote again. Maybe kindness is like planting a seed. You can't see it grow yet, but one day, something will bloom. I hope it blooms for him. She closed the diary, hugged it tight, and lay back. Her stomach groaned. The shadows in the room stretched long, twisting with the flicker of headlights from outside. Again, she thought she heard an engine roar. This time, closer. The deep growl of something expensive rolling down their worn street. But she was too tired to sit up. She closed her eyes and let the sound blend with her dreams. The following morning, the whispers began. Did you see it? One neighbor asked another on the steps of their building. A car. Black as midnight. Stopped right outside. Sat there for half an hour. Amara overheard them as she left for school. Her heart skipped. She didn't look at the corner, though she felt the weight of unseen eyes. At school, the same hunger gnawed, but today her mind wandered. She kept thinking of the boy. His hands trembling over her sandwich. His whisper of thanks. She had saved him, even if only for a moment. But who was he? Where had he gone? That afternoon, when she walked past the lamppost where she'd found him, the space was empty. Only a scrap of paper fluttered against the curb. She picked it up. It was the wrapper of her sandwich. She folded it carefully and slipped it into her bag, like a secret keepsake. At dinner, Malik chattered about school, his words spilling over one another. Angela smiled faintly, though her hands shook with fatigue. Amara picked at her own food, a boiled egg split in half, one piece for her, one for her brother. She forced herself to eat slowly, even though her body screamed for more. When Malik ran off to play, Angela leaned closer. "You've been quiet, baby. Something wrong?" Amara hesitated. She wanted to say it, to admit everything. But instead she forced a smile. "Just tired." Her mother studied her for a long moment, then nodded. That night, Amara dreamed of the boy again. This time he wasn't crying. He was standing in a field of light, holding her sandwich like it was treasure. Behind him, the shadow of a man stood, tall, broad-shouldered, a face hidden in darkness. The boy reached for the man's hand, and together they turned toward her. She woke with a start, breath shallow. Her diary lay open beside her, though she hadn't opened it. The page she'd written on glowed faintly in the moonlight. Maybe kindness is like planting a seed. She didn't know that her seed had already sprouted. That somewhere beyond her cracked ceiling, in a house with gates taller than trees, a powerful man had learned her name. And that the shadows of hunger were about to be pierced by the blinding light of wealth. The third morning came with rain. It wasn't a heavy downpour, but a thin drizzle that turned the streets into mirrors of broken neon signs and rust-streaked brick walls. Amara pulled her hood tight as she walked to school, her sneakers soaking quickly in the puddles. She glanced toward the lamppost at Maple and 12th, the place where she had first seen him. The boy. It was empty. No small figure curled against the concrete. No trembling hands reaching for food. No wide, hungry eyes. The corner looked the same as always, trash cans dented and overflowing, graffiti curling up the bricks like vines, a single rusted bicycle frame chained to a post. But the boy was gone, as though he had never existed. Amara slowed, her heart giving a strange, uneven beat. For 2 days, she had carried the image of him in her chest, sharper than hunger. She had fed him her only meal, and in her mind that made him part of her story. To see the space so starkly empty now felt like losing him all over again. She bent down and searched the ground, as though he might have left something behind. A scrap of fabric. A clue. But there was nothing, except the damp wrapper from her sandwich that she had tucked away yesterday. As she straightened, she caught a flicker of movement across the street. A man in a dark coat stood beneath an awning, his face obscured by the tilt of a wide umbrella. He wasn't from Eastbrook, that much was clear. His shoes shone too cleanly, his posture too straight. For a brief moment, she thought his gaze was fixed directly on her. Amara's breath caught. But when she blinked, the man had turned, disappearing into the drizzle. At school, the day dragged. She couldn't focus on the teacher's voice, couldn't hold her pencil steady over math problems. She kept seeing the boy's face. She had expected, no, she had hoped, to see him again. To know that he had found safety, that he wasn't hungry anymore. But he was gone, and with him went a piece of her certainty. At lunch, her stomach growled so loudly the girl beside her snorted with laughter. "You sound like a broken machine, Amara," she teased. Amara folded her arms across her belly, cheeks burning. She had no reply. That evening, she lingered by the window while Malik played with paper airplanes on the floor. The rain had cleared, leaving the streets slick and shining under the streetlights. Across the road, a black SUV rolled past, slow, deliberate. Its windows were tinted like mirrors, swallowing the glow of the lamps. Amara leaned closer to the glass, her heart hammering. The SUV paused for the briefest moment in front of their building. Then it moved on, disappearing into the dark. She wanted to tell her mother, but when Angela arrived home with her shoulders sagging and her hands raw from hours of labor, Amara swallowed the words. What good would it do? They already had enough shadows pressing on them. The next morning, Amara tried again. She walked to school, eyes searching every corner, every alley, every doorway. She asked quietly at the market stalls if anyone had seen a boy, small and shoeless, alone. Most vendors shook their heads. A few muttered that there were always lost kids on these streets. What made this one any different? But to Amara, he was different. He was the boy who had looked at her like she was a miracle. At the corner of Maple, she crouched down, fingers brushing the damp concrete. Her hand touched something hard. She pulled it free. It was a small, golden button. Not the kind worn by kids in her neighborhood. This one gleamed faintly even in the weak light, etched with an intricate crest, two lions facing each other, a crown above them. It was heavy, expensive, out of place. Amara turned it over in her palm. The boy hadn't been wearing anything with buttons, she was sure. But she had found it here, where he had been. She slipped it into her pocket, a cold weight she couldn't explain. That night, she opened her diary and wrote quickly. Day 3. The boy is gone. Vanished. I found a button. It doesn't belong here. Who was he really? She paused, the pencil trembling in her hand. Then she added. Maybe he was never just a lost boy. Later, when the apartment was quiet, she heard it again. Engines. Not the rattling of old sedans or the backfire of delivery vans. No, these were deep, throaty growls. Expensive engines. They echoed down the block, their sound vibrating against the glass of her window. Amara pushed the curtain aside. This time, it wasn't one SUV. It was 3. All black. All identical. They glided down the narrow street, too polished, too sharp against the backdrop of Eastbrook's decay. The first stopped at the far end, headlights cutting across the cracked pavement. The second slowed near the lamppost at Maple. The third idled right in front of her building. Amara's breath caught in her throat. For a long, stretched moment, nothing happened. The engines rumbled, steady and menacing. Then, one by one, the headlights cut out. Darkness. She stumbled back from the window, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Minutes passed before the sound of engines roared again. The SUVs pulled away, vanishing into the night as silently as they had come. When Angela came home, Amara almost told her everything, the boy, the hunger, the button, the cars. But the words tangled on her tongue. How could she explain something she didn't understand herself? Instead, she forced a smile and took her mother's bag from her hands. But later, as she lay in bed, she held the golden button tight in her palm. Its edges pressed into her skin, sharp and real. Somewhere out there, someone knew the boy. Someone was looking for him. And Amara's small act of kindness had quietly drawn her into a story much bigger than hunger. The weekend came wrapped in unusual silence. For 2 days, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, as though the air itself had grown wary. Amara felt it in her bones. The button she'd found at the lamppost never left her pocket. She rolled it between her fingers in class, at home, even in her sleep. The lines etched into its face caught the faintest glimmers of light, a constant reminder that the boy's disappearance had left behind more than questions. Her mother noticed her distraction but said nothing. Angela had grown used to her daughter's quiet thoughtfulness, mistaking it for the weight of poverty when in truth it was something else now: anticipation, unease, the feeling of being perched on the edge of something too large to name. On Sunday afternoon, Amara sat on the stoop outside their apartment. Malik played hopscotch on the faded chalk squares someone had drawn days before, his laughter rising bright against the dull backdrop of Eastbrook's crumbling buildings. Amara clutched her diary on her lap, pencil resting in her hand. The last line she had written stared back at her. Maybe he was never just a lost boy. The sound came first. A low rumble that quivered through the pavement beneath her feet. At first, she thought it was thunder. The sky was gray, after all, heavy with clouds. But thunder didn't build like that, didn't roll closer, stronger, like a storm carried on wheels. Malik stopped mid-jump, eyes wide. "What's that?" Amara stood, clutching his hand. Inside, Malik. But before they could move, the corner of the street erupted with color and chrome. One by one, they appeared, sleek machines that belonged more to glossy magazines than cracked Eastbrook roads. A cherry-red Ferrari, its engine purring like a predator. A cobalt blue Lamborghini with scissor doors that hissed open briefly before snapping shut. A midnight black Bugatti, low and wide, gleaming like a panther in the fading light. And behind them, more, Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, Maseratis. A parade of wealth so foreign it looked almost unreal, as though the street had become a stage for a dream no one in Eastbrook had ever been invited to. Neighbors spilled out of doorways, their mouths open, their phones clutched in shaking hands. Children screamed with glee, running alongside the line of cars as though chasing fireworks. The engines growled in harmony, a symphony of power that rattled windows and made the very air quiver. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the convoy stopped. Right in front of Amara's building. The world went silent. Angela burst through the door, apron still tied around her waist, eyes wide with alarm. "Amara! Malik! Get inside now!" But Amara couldn't move. Her feet felt nailed to the stoop. Her hand, still holding the golden button, tightened until the metal cut her palm. She knew. Somehow, she knew this was for her. The first car door opened. A man stepped out, tall, his suit cut so perfectly it looked stitched to his skin. His sunglasses reflected the gawking crowd. Another man followed. Then another. Bodyguards, their movements precise, purposeful. They scanned the crowd, their eyes cold, their expressions unreadable. From the back of the Bugatti, a different figure emerged. He was older, his hair streaked with silver, his posture commanding. His coat was long, black, tailored with the same crest as the button Amara carried. Even from a distance, his presence bent the air around him. People whispered his name in hushed tones, as though afraid it might summon him closer. Elijah Cross, someone muttered. The billionaire. Amara's breath caught. She had heard the name before. Everyone had. A man who owned half the city, whose face appeared on news broadcasts when companies rose or fell at his. Appeared on news broadcasts when companies rose or fell at his command. He was a figure of wealth, of distance, of untouchable power. And now he stood on her street, his gaze fixed on her. Her knees threatened to buckle. She clutched Malik's hand tighter. Elijah Cross walked forward, his steps slow but deliberate, the bodyguards forming a shield at his back. He stopped at the foot of her stoop. For a long moment, he said nothing. The street seemed to lean in, waiting. Finally, his voice, smooth and commanding, "You're the girl." Amara blinked. Me? Her voice cracked, trembling under the weight of all those eyes. Elijah studied her, his gaze sharp yet strangely softened at the edges. Then he reached into his coat and held up a small object. It was her lunchbox. Blue, chipped, stickers peeling. The one she had given away to the boy. Amara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. He told me, Elijah said, his voice low enough that only she and Malik could hear. My son. He told me about the girl who gave him food when no one else would. Who gave him her only meal. His jaw tightened, and for a moment something broke through the polished steel of his demeanor, something raw, human. You saved him. Amara's heart raced. She wanted to speak, but no words formed. Behind Elijah, one of the cars shifted. A door opened. And there he was. The boy. His hair combed now, his face scrubbed clean, but his eyes, those wide, grateful eyes, were the same. He clutched the edge of the car door, staring at her with a smile so fragile it looked like it might shatter. Amara, he called, his voice brighter than she remembered. The crowd erupted into gasps. Phones flashed as people filmed, the scene already too extraordinary to believe. Elijah turned back to her. My son ran from me. He thought money was all I cared about. But you, he paused, swallowing hard. You showed him kindness. You gave him dignity when the world looked away. And for that, there is no repayment great enough. Amara's mother finally reached her side, pulling her close, shielding her from the weight of the spectacle. We don't need anything from you, Angela said sharply, her voice trembling but firm. But Elijah only smiled faintly. I believe that. Which is why what comes next is not for you to refuse. He gestured to the line of cars. The world has overlooked this place, this street, this family. That ends now. The engines roared again, shaking the air. The convoy of wealth had not come simply to dazzle. It had come as an announcement. And for the first time in her life, Amara realized, her single act of kindness had pulled her into a story so vast, so impossible, that her small, hungry world would never be the same again. The street was still buzzing long after the engines quieted. Neighbors whispered in clusters, children darted close to the sleek cars before being ushered away by bodyguards, and cell phones caught every glimmer of wealth under Eastbrook's flickering street lamps. But in the middle of the chaos, it was just Amara, her mother, her little brother, and the billionaire who had brought his empire to her doorstep. Elijah Cross stood tall, his polished shoes on cracked pavement, his dark coat sweeping as the wind picked up. His son lingered at his side now, no longer the trembling lost boy Amara had met beneath the lamppost, but still fragile in the way he looked at her, as if she were the only anchor in the room. Come inside, Elijah said at last. His voice was not a request. It was iron, softened by something rare, gratitude. Angela stiffened. "We don't invite strangers into our home," she said quickly. Her hand was tight on Amara's shoulder, protective, wary. But Elijah's eyes flicked to the boy, then back to Angela. "I believe my son owes your daughter his life. The least you can allow me is to explain." For a moment, tension hung in the air. Then Angela, sensing the gravity of the moment, nodded stiffly. She led them into the cramped apartment, where the scent of old plaster and tea leaves lingered. The billionaire had probably never stepped foot in a place like this, yet he entered without flinching, his presence filling the small living room until it seemed the walls might buckle. The boy, whose name Amara still didn't know, brushed past and stood awkwardly near the sofa. His gaze flickered between her and the floor. Angela crossed her arms. "Speak your piece." Elijah removed his gloves slowly, placing them neatly on the table as though even here, precision was his armor. Then he looked at Amara. His voice, when it came, was softer than she expected. "My son's name is Adrian." The boy's head jerked up, meeting Amara's eyes. She whispered it under her breath, "Adrian." The name fit him somehow, delicate yet strong. Elijah continued. "You must understand, I built an empire from nothing. Steel, finance, technology. I clawed my way up from the dirt, and along the way I made one mistake. I believed that money could protect what I loved. That wealth could stand in for presence, for warmth, for love itself." He paused, his jaw tightening. "His mother died when he was 4. I buried myself in work. I thought if I gave him palaces, tutors, the finest clothes, it would be enough. I thought comfort was the same as care. But Adrian," he turned toward his son, his voice faltering for the first time. "Adrian grew up surrounded by everything, yet starved of what mattered most." Amara's heart clenched. She remembered the boy's trembling hands clutching her sandwich, his whisper of thanks. She realized now it wasn't just hunger that had broken him, it was loneliness. Elijah's gaze shifted back to her. "He ran from me. Vanished from his gilded cage. For 3 days, I searched. I unleashed half the city's resources, investigators, police, every tool my wealth could command. But I could not find him. And then," his voice cracked slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Then he told me about you." Amara's breath caught. "He told me about the girl with nothing who gave him everything," Elijah said, his words steady but carrying a weight that seemed to bow his shoulders. "How you sat with him, how you gave him your meal, your only meal. And when he spoke, there was light in his eyes I had not seen since his mother lived." Angela shifted uncomfortably, her arms folding tighter. "So you came here to parade your cars? To make a spectacle?" Elijah shook his head. "No. I came here because I needed you to understand something. In all my life, in all my billions, I have never been humbled. Never been made to feel small. Until your daughter showed my son what compassion truly means. She gave him dignity when all my wealth could not. That pierced me deeper than any failure, any loss." Silence hung heavy in the room. Only the faint rattle of the fridge filled it. Angela glanced at Amara, her eyes searching. Amara swallowed hard, her throat tight. She wanted to ask so many things, but her voice was barely a whisper when she finally said, "Why me?" Elijah looked at her with eyes that seemed both sharp and broken. "Because kindness like yours cannot be bought. It is pure. It is rare. My son did not find it in the marble halls I built. He found it in you. Adrian stepped forward then, his small hands twisting nervously. He looked at Amara like she was still the girl on the cracked sidewalk, the girl who had saved him with bread and juice. I was so hungry, he said quietly. But more than food. I just wanted someone to see me. Amara blinked back tears. She understood that hunger too, the hunger of being unseen, overlooked in the shadow of survival. Elijah reached into his coat and pulled out something small. It was her lunchbox. He placed it carefully on the table, its chipped paint stark against the polished leather of his gloves. This, Amara, is more valuable than all my cars, all my companies. Because it carried a lesson I had forgotten: wealth means nothing without humanity. Angela frowned, her suspicion still etched deep. So what do you want from us? To turn us into some story on the evening news? The poor girl who fed the billionaire's boy? Elijah shook his head. No. I want to change what I can. I cannot give Adrian back the years I stole from him. But I can honor what your daughter gave him. And that begins with making sure she never knows hunger again. Amara's cheeks burned, her pulse racing. She didn't want to be bought. But the sincerity in Elijah's eyes was undeniable. This wasn't about money. It was about a man who had finally realized what he had lost. Angela spoke slowly, cautiously. We don't need mansions or riches. My children need stability. They need safety. They need food on the table, schools that don't crumble, a chance at something better than this. Elijah listened, nodding. For the first time, he didn't argue. He didn't dictate. He simply absorbed the truth. And Amara, sitting with her diary still clutched to her chest, realized something too. Her small act of kindness had not only saved a boy, it had cracked open the heart of a man who had built walls taller than his wealth. For the first time, she saw Elijah Cross not as the billionaire on the news, but as a father who had almost lost everything that truly mattered. And she knew this was only the beginning. The morning after Elijah Cross stepped into their apartment, Eastbrook woke to whispers that traveled faster than the buses that rattled down cracked roads. People spoke of the convoy of cars, of the billionaire who had come to the poorest corner of the city, of the girl whose act of kindness had summoned him. Some scoffed, calling it a fairy tale. Others swore they had seen it with their own eyes. But for Amara, the day began the way all her days did, with hunger. She sat at the kitchen table with Malik, sharing the last 2 pieces of toast. Her mother's brow was furrowed deeper than usual, her hands gripping her coffee mug as if it held answers. Neither spoke of the night before, though the silence was filled with it. Then, at precisely 10 o'clock, the rumble returned. Engines. Not one. Dozens. The apartment shook as polished cars once again filled the street. Neighbors pressed against windows, their voices rising in disbelief. Children ran barefoot into the road, their laughter mixing with awe. And then, as before, the world stopped. A knock came at the door. Not frantic. Not demanding. Just steady. Angela opened it cautiously. Standing there was Elijah Cross, flanked by 2 bodyguards. He was not dressed for intimidation today. He wore a simple suit, his silver-streaked hair neatly combed, his eyes sharp but, strangely, human. "May I come in?" he asked. Angela hesitated, then stepped aside. This time, Elijah did not come empty-handed. 2 men carried in a velvet-lined case, setting it on the table with a weighty thud. When they opened it, light seemed to spill into the small apartment. Inside lay stacks of documents, envelopes, keys. One was gilded with the crest Amara had seen on the button she still kept in her pocket. Another was heavy with gold-embossed lettering. Elijah gestured. "This, Ms. Johnson, is for your family. A home in Riverview Heights, large enough to breathe, safe enough to dream. A trust fund for your children's education, enough to carry them through the finest schools in the world. And an allowance to ensure you never work yourself into exhaustion again." Angela's hand flew to her mouth. Malik's eyes widened, reflecting the shine of the golden keys. But Amara said nothing. She only stared at Elijah, her small fists curled tightly in her lap. Finally, she whispered, "Why?" Elijah turned toward her, his face unreadable. "Because it is what I know how to give. I cannot undo your hunger. I cannot repay the dignity you gave my son. But I can ensure you never feel that pain again." The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Angela reached out as if to touch the keys, but Amara's voice cut through the stillness. "No." Elijah blinked. "No." Amara lifted her chin, her eyes steady. "I don't want a mansion. I don't want money in a bank or schools with marble floors. I don't want food only for me." Her voice shook, but she pressed on. "I want food for everyone. For every child on this street. For every mother who works until she falls asleep standing. For every kid who hides their hunger in class because they're too proud to beg." Angela's breath caught. "Amara." But Elijah raised a hand to stop her. His gaze fixed on the girl, the corners of his mouth tightening as if he'd been struck. "You would refuse this?" he asked quietly. "All of this, for something that isn't yours?" Amara nodded. Her voice was small but unshakable. "Because it is mine. This is my street. These are my people. If I eat and they don't, I'm still hungry." The words settled over the room like thunder. Elijah stared at her for a long moment, his polished mask cracking under the weight of her truth. He had seen boardrooms quake, nations bow, empires shift at his command. But never had a child disarmed him with such simple, devastating clarity. He exhaled slowly, as if releasing decades of illusions. "You speak with more wisdom than men twice my age. Perhaps more than I myself have ever had." He turned to his aides. "Make arrangements. Not for one family," he swept his hand toward the window, where the street outside teemed with curious neighbors. "For all of them." The aides exchanged stunned glances. Elijah's voice hardened. "Food programs. Scholarships. Community centers. Jobs. I want it done in weeks, not months. Every child here will eat. Every parent will rest. Every family will rise." The room erupted with gasps. Angela's hand trembled as she reached for Amara's shoulder. Malik grinned, not fully understanding but feeling the joy anyway. But Amara only sat quietly, her eyes on Elijah. "Not just charity," she said softly. "Not something that fades when you leave. It has to last." Elijah's eyes softened, a rare flicker of humility breaking through. "Then it will last. You have my word." Outside, the first truck engines already rumbled. Not supercars this time, but food vans, white, lined up behind the glittering convoy, their doors painted with Elijah's crest. Workers began unloading crates of bread, vegetables, milk, rice. The crowd outside broke into cheers, children rushing forward with arms wide. The noise filled the apartment, spilling in like sunlight. But Elijah's eyes remained on Amara. "You have done what no board, no empire, no fortune has ever done," he said quietly. "You reminded me that wealth is worthless if it feeds only itself." Amara's throat tightened. She wanted to cry, but instead she opened her diary, flipping to a blank page. Her pencil scratched softly as the noise of the world roared around her. Today, the street ate. Today, kindness grew bigger than me. Maybe this is what seeds do when they bloom. When she looked up, Elijah Cross was still watching her, not with the eyes of a billionaire, but of a man who had finally remembered what it meant to be human. The storm that had hovered over Eastbrook for years seemed to break the next morning. Not in thunder or lightning, but in light. Amara woke to the sound of voices outside her window. Not angry shouts. Not the hollow laughter of men on the corner. These were brighter, children's squeals, neighbors calling in joy, the clatter of crates being unloaded from trucks that lined the street like a festival. She rushed to the window and blinked. What she saw was nothing short of a miracle. Rows of food trucks gleamed in the early sun, their doors swung wide. Men and women in crisp uniforms handed out bags of rice, flour, bread, fresh fruit. Families carried boxes into their apartments, their faces alight with disbelief. The cracked street that had always smelled faintly of exhaust and despair now smelled of oranges, baked bread, and coffee. Malik pressed beside her, eyes huge. "Amara, look. We're rich." Amara smiled faintly, though her heart whispered, "Not rich. Fed." Outside, Elijah Cross stood at the center of it all. No longer the untouchable billionaire with mirrored cars and glass towers, he was here on the ground, sleeves rolled, speaking to mothers and fathers as though they were equals. His bodyguards hovered nearby, uneasy at the crowd pressing close, but Elijah didn't seem to care. When he saw Amara step into the street, he broke away and approached her. "You did this," he said quietly, gesturing to the crates stacked like small mountains. "Not me. If it had been up to me, I would have handed you a mansion and walked away, convinced I'd done enough. But you," his gaze softened. "You reminded me that wealth without purpose is emptiness dressed in gold." Amara lowered her eyes. "It was just one meal. One lunchbox." "No," Elijah said firmly. "It was everything. That boy," he looked back at Adrian, who was laughing with Malik as they shared an orange, "didn't need another bodyguard. He didn't need another toy. He needed to be seen. And somehow, in the middle of your own hunger, you gave him that. Do you understand how extraordinary that is?" Amara shook her head. "It wasn't extraordinary. It was right." Elijah's lips curved into a faint, almost reverent smile. "And that is why it is extraordinary." By afternoon, news cameras had arrived. Word had spread beyond Eastbrook. The sight of supercars flanking food trucks was too impossible to ignore. Reporters swarmed, microphones jostling for Elijah's attention. "Mr. Cross, why here? Is this a publicity stunt? Who is the girl?" Elijah raised a hand, silencing them. "This is not about me," he said, his voice steady. "This is about her." He turned, placing his hand gently on Amara's shoulder. The cameras swiveled, lenses capturing her wide eyes, her worn sneakers, her still hungry frame. "This girl gave my son his life back with nothing more than compassion. She reminded me of a truth I had long forgotten: no empire survives if it does not serve its people." Gasps rippled through the crowd. It was not the language of a businessman. It was the language of a man confessing his own failures. That night, Elijah returned not to his penthouse overlooking the skyline, but to a quiet boardroom filled with men and women in pressed suits. His advisors looked at him in shock as he laid out his decision. "We will restructure," Elijah said simply. "Our wealth will not hoard, it will flow. Factories will partner with communities, profits will build schools, food programs will expand nationwide. I will not leave behind towers of glass and empty accounts when I am gone. I will leave people fed. Children educated. Streets like Eastbrook transformed." One executive cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, that would, well, it would dismantle our profit margins. Investors will revolt. Our position," Elijah cut in, his voice sharp, "is meaningless if it feeds no one but ourselves. We've built castles in the sky while children sleep hungry below. That ends now." There was silence. Then, slowly, reluctantly, heads nodded. The weight of his conviction silenced resistance. Elijah Cross was not a man easily swayed once his mind was set. And this time, he had been swayed not by numbers, but by a little girl with an empty lunchbox. Back in Eastbrook, Amara wrote in her diary by lamplight. "Today the cameras came. They looked at me like I was important. But I'm not. I'm just hungry. I'm just me. Still, if my hunger could teach someone like Elijah Cross, maybe it can teach the world too." She closed the diary, but her thoughts kept spinning. She pictured every child on her block sitting down to a meal without shame. She pictured her mother coming home with energy still left in her body. She pictured Malik growing up without ever knowing the gnawing ache of emptiness in his stomach. The possibilities stretched so far they frightened her. The next morning, a sky once gray and heavy seemed to open wide. Sunlight poured through, golden and fierce, illuminating the buildings that had always seemed dull and broken. For the first time, Eastbrook looked alive. Children carried backpacks filled with new supplies, volunteers painted over graffiti with bright colors, and food trucks rolled in daily. The rhythm of hunger that had drummed in Amara's belly for so long began to fade, replaced by something new, hope. Elijah arrived again, but this time he brought no convoy. Just a single car, modest compared to the spectacle before. He knocked on Angela's door like a neighbor, not a king. "I wanted to see it," he admitted when she opened. "Not from reports. Not from balance sheets. From here." He stepped onto the stoop with Amara, watching as Adrian played tag with Malik in the street. His lips tightened, emotion flickering across his usually controlled face. "I've built skyscrapers taller than clouds," he said softly. "I've crushed rivals, outbid nations, stood on top of the world. Yet none of it filled the hollow inside me. But today, seeing this street, hearing those children laugh," he exhaled. "This feels like the first honest empire I've ever built." Amara looked at him, her voice quiet but firm. "Then don't stop. If you stop, it was just charity. If you keep going, it's change." Elijah turned to her, and for once, the great Elijah Cross did not look like a man in control of the world. He looked like a man humbled by a child's wisdom. He nodded slowly. "Then we will keep going. Together." The wind picked up, carrying the sound of laughter, the scent of bread, the warmth of sunlight breaking free from clouds. And as Amara stood there, diary pressed against her heart, she realized something: when kindness is planted, storms cannot stop it. One meal had become a movement. One act of love had opened the sky. It began on one street. One block in Eastbrook that had always been ignored by city officials, overlooked by progress, and forgotten by wealth. For years, its cracked pavement and empty cupboards had been symbols of despair. But now, every morning the air buzzed with the sound of food trucks, the chatter of children, the hum of possibility. Amara stood at the window, diary clutched in her hands, watching the world move differently than it had before. Her street, once defined by hunger, had become a place where bellies were full, laughter was louder, and dreams had space to grow. But she didn't yet realize how far her story had traveled. She would learn soon. The first sign came 2 weeks later. A letter arrived in their small mailbox, addressed not to Amara Johnson or to the family, but directly to Amara. The envelope was thick, the paper heavy, the handwriting elegant. She tore it open and gasped. It was from a girl in another city, hundreds of miles away. Dear Amara, I read about you in the newspaper. I don't have much either, but yesterday I shared my lunch with a boy at my school who never eats. I thought of you. Thank you for reminding me what it means to care. Amara pressed the letter to her chest, her eyes filling with tears. She had never received a letter before, not even on her birthday. A week later, another arrived. Then 10 more. Then 50. From children, from parents, from strangers who had read about the girl who gave her meal away. Stories of shared food, of kindness passed along like a torch. The postman began delivering bundles tied with string, shaking his head in wonder. You're famous, little one, he chuckled one morning. But more than that, you're changing people. Elijah Cross stood back and watched it unfold. At first, he had thought his part in the story would be limited to Eastbrook, to the promises he made to Amara in that small living room. But the ripples refused to stop at the borders of one street. Reporters followed him relentlessly. They called it the Cross Reform. Some cynics sneered, claiming it was only a billionaire's guilt. But others, millions of others, saw the truth. They saw how distribution centers opened in cities long forgotten. They saw scholarships pour into neighborhoods where children had been counted out before they could even try. They saw factories pay fair wages, hospitals receive new funding, schools rebuilt with bright windows and sturdy roofs. And everywhere Elijah went, he spoke not of himself, but of Amara. My empire was steel and glass, he said into microphones, his voice broadcast across the world. But she reminded me that an empire means nothing if it does not feed its people. A girl with an empty lunchbox taught me what no boardroom ever could: kindness is the true wealth. The words burned through the headlines, igniting conversations in boardrooms, schools, and homes. Meanwhile, Amara remained herself. She still walked to school in her worn sneakers, still scribbled in her diary with her stub of a pencil. She never grew used to the attention, never let it harden her. If anything, it humbled her. One afternoon, her teacher asked her to speak in front of the class. She stood nervously, her knees trembling, but when she opened her mouth, her voice carried more strength than she felt. I didn't save anyone, she said softly. I just gave what I had. And it wasn't much. But sometimes, not much is enough to change someone's world. And maybe it can change more than that. Her classmates, who once had mocked her for empty lunches, now listened in silence. Some even lowered their eyes, ashamed. For the first time, Amara felt not invisible, but seen. As the months passed, the changes spread beyond Eastbrook. Elijah kept his promise. His empire transformed. But he insisted on one thing, that every program, every initiative, every foundation bore not his name, but hers. The Amara Foundation for Food Security opened first in Eastbrook, then in cities across the country, then across oceans. It was not charity in the shallow sense. It was infrastructure, food banks tied to schools, urban gardens tended by communities, programs that ensured no child went to class on an empty stomach. And at the center of every launch was the same story, a girl with nothing who gave everything. One spring morning, Amara and her family were invited to a ceremony downtown. Angela was nervous, Malik thrilled, Amara quiet as always. When they arrived, they found a crowd filling the square, hundreds of people, reporters, families, children holding banners with her name. On the stage stood Elijah, his hand resting gently on Adrian's shoulder. Today, Elijah declared, his voice ringing against the tall buildings, we dedicate this initiative not to me, not to wealth, not to power, but to a girl who taught us all the simplest truth. One act of kindness can feed a child, a family, a community, and one day, the world. He gestured for Amara to step forward. She froze, her stomach flipping, but Malik tugged her hand until she moved. The crowd erupted into cheers. Cameras flashed. Elijah knelt, his voice low enough only for her to hear. You once asked me for something that would last. Look around you, Amara. This will last. Her throat tightened. She wanted to speak, but her voice wavered. So instead she opened her diary, found a blank page, and wrote quickly, then held it up for him to see. A meal shared is never lost. Elijah smiled, eyes shining with something close to tears. He turned back to the microphone and repeated her words. The crowd roared. Years later, when people spoke of the change, they did not remember the convoy of supercars. They did not remember the billionaire's empire. They remembered the girl. They remembered the empty lunchbox that became a symbol larger than any fortune. And Amara, who never forgot the hunger in her belly, who never forgot the boy under the lamppost, continued to write in her diary. Her last entry that year read, it began with a sandwich. But it was never about the sandwich. It was about seeing someone, even when the world looks away. If the sky can open above Eastbrook, maybe one day it can open above us all. The sun dipped low that evening, casting the neighborhood in gold. Children played on streets once broken, laughter ringing against walls painted bright. Families shared meals on stoops, bread passed from hand to hand. And high above, the sky stretched wide, open, endless. The empire had changed. The world had begun to change. All because one girl, with nothing but a single meal, chose to give.